Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for downloading this Gumroad, and I really do appreciate all your support. I wanted to make a quick video, kind of not only just sharing my brushes, but explaining a little bit how I use them, how I organize them in the set. I did this before with my brushes and how you use them. This is the second part. So this is the latest update. This is a further curated list of my brushes as of July 22nd, 2018. So if you're watching this and there's a newer version, just watch that. All right, so let me show you my brush list, and I'll even zoom in on them a little bit. I think it's a little bit more brushes than before. But it's also curated. There's some brushes that I removed, a lot of which that I removed from the earlier set, and a lot of new ones that I added in with this new set. So the way that I organize them, very similar to the way I organized them before, is a lot of the top brushes, the brushes I use here on the top of the list, are typically brushes I use quite often. So these are all brushes that I'll use as like sketching brushes, or like a workhorse brush, a brush that I use over and over again for anything from just like doing line work to actually doing 80% of the painting in one image. I think it's very typical for me to use basically the same brush for a large majority of the painting, and then use some of these other extra brushes like leaf brushes, grass brushes and stuff more towards later on when I'm adding in a little bit of texture, or trying to sell the realism of different materials, or adding particle effects. So depending on which brush I use of these workhorse brushes really kind of dictates the style and mood of the painting. So I'm going to go through them one by one. That's just a quick overview. So yeah, let's start with the workhorse brushes, right? The sketching brushes. These are the brushes that I use quite often. Usually I'll have two brushes side by side like this. One will be quite simply just pen pressure set to one of them, the transfer settings. The pen pressure is set on opacity jitter, and then the other brush would typically have flow jitter, right? So pen pressure set to flow jitter. And if you guys don't know what the difference between opacity and flow is, opacity would be, if you think of it as like an ink brush or an airbrush, it's adding more water to the ink to thin it down, to make it a little bit more transparent, right? So I'm adding, if I were to use this brush, I'm adding more water, right, to thin down the ink. And then the harder down I push is like adding more pigment or more ink to the brush, or you know, whatever medium you're using to make it more opaque and make it darker. Where flow is a little different. Flow is like putting less ink on a brush versus putting more ink on a brush. So, I mean, typically I'll, sometimes, like, especially right here, these first two, one will be set to opacity, a jitter on pen pressure, and the second one will be on flow. Giving two different kind of feels. This is definitely a much more harder brush. This is a more rendery, soft, blendy kind of brush. So I have both there, just in case. Another thing is, like, oftentimes when I use these workhorse brushes, these top sketching brushes, I'll set the eraser to the same brush that I'm painting with, just so that it feels the same when I erase away. Like it feels like the same brush was used, the same style was used to the whole painting. Sometimes if you use the eraser with a different brush, it's not like a violation or anything. It's just, it feels different. So the next set of brushes is it's a charcoal brush that I really, really like. And it's a really good workhorse brush, really good sketching brush, because you could definitely push down and make some solid marks, or you could thin it down and make some line. And it has just enough of like a rough edge that doesn't feel too digital, right? It feels really, really nice. I think I got that from one of John Park's. A lot of these brushes I got from other sets. A lot of artists do that. We we brushes are like STDs, they just kind of like, they just go around the art community, the concept art community. Everybody has the same brushes. They all get passed around. So I would say like 75% of these brushes I did not make, right? I got them from other sets, or I modified them or changed them a little bit. So I'll let you know the brushes that I used, the brushes that I made specifically. So this brush is really good. Again, it's kind of where this brush can be a little bit softer. This one could be a little bit more rigid. It has that unpredictable edge. It's really good for sketching. It's kind of a mix between like opaque painting and sketching, but really great workhorse brush. This one's a more traditional like rectangle brush. Those hard edges, you're able to paint with really rigid edges, and its settings are set to under shape dynamics. Angle jitter is set to direction, so it just kind of trails in the direction that you want to go. But really good, just for like chunking in solid shapes, solid silhouettes and stuff like that. This is another charcoal brush, kind of does the same thing. I have it. I think this one is probably set to transfer on opacity on pen pressure. So this is an example of one with opacity set to pen pressure. Another thing, if you guys don't know, but you can quickly adjust like say I'm using this one that's not set opacity to pen pressure, but I want to change the opacity on the fly. You can just hit the number keys, and I'll often do that. Where if I just like, if you see, let me move the screen down a little bit so you could see the opacity right there. If I just press like 5, I'm going to hit 50% opacity. If I just press 3, it's going to do 30% opacity. 2, and then 1, you see how that works. And then if I hit 0, 0, it goes back to 100% opacity. So something to keep in mind. I don't really mess with the opacity too much. I don't really mess with it that much, honestly. So that's it. If I want to change the opacity, I just hit the number keys, and I rarely do it, but sometimes it's useful. So it's a nice little trick, little quick hotkey to get the opacity setting where you want it to be. Another square charcoal brush. This one has a lot more texture. This one, again, it's such a beautiful texture. I've seen a lot of brushes with this exact texture, and it just feels really good. Really good charcoal brush. Good for sketching, like portraits and stuff like that. Okay, so this one is a really good like line brush. So I use it sometimes with line work. I use it sometimes with just wanting to put down an opaque sharp mark. And look at that, it has such a nice texture to it. It just feels really good to paint with. This brush I use quite often. Anytime you see like a flat brush like this, it's a kind of charcoal brush that I would use for painting landscapes or blocking in like positive and negative shapes, like a silhouette. Because you're able to get such a hard, sharp mark, and it's flat. You're able to show how space is receding, and with the same brush you can get nice kind of blurred edges. So this brush is really good for getting kind of like a way of getting like nice soft edges to your mark making, and then also pushing down hard, get really hard edges to your mark making. Really good for like conveying space mostly. Yeah, so this is a really good sketching brush just for early on. Maybe not a brush that I would use for like 80% of a painting. It's not going to solve all the problems, but really, really solid brush for like landscape. This brush I've used a lot. It has a really nice just general texture. Again, it's kind of a good sketching brush for like getting that charcoal feel. So another one of those. This is a brush that I would use for like 80% of the painting because I just feel it has so much versatility. On a light touch, it has such a great texture attached to it. It's like almost like a dissolve filter, right? Like the way it looks. Also, if you push down, you're going to get a much more solid mark. And then it has just enough of a rough edge to not feel too digital, but not too soft where it's almost like you lose your edges too much, or you're not able to define certain things. So I feel like it's a really good, like, kind of middle of the road brush where you have so much versatility. Another thing to point out is a lot of my brushes I like to have, if you go to shape dynamics, if you go to pen tilt, I use pen tilt on a lot of these types of brushes. Some of them I have it set to direction, but most of them are on pen tilt. I just really like the way pen tilt feels. Like, depending on the way that I tilt my brush, it's going to give me a different type of mark. So like if I hold it like, straight on like this, I'll get a nice flat mark. And then if I tilt the pen in such a way that I get a nice broad mark. So it gives me like a nice amount of control over the types of marks that I'm making. So you'll see that again in this next brush. I also have pen tilt set to it. Oftentimes it breaks in Photoshop, but it's kind of annoying, but a small annoyance for a function that I think is really, really great. So this is another brush that I will do a lot of painting with. It's just a really great, I put these two next to each other because they're like brother and sisters to me. Like I will use this brush in conjunction with this brush because I feel they fit together really nicely. Like texturally, they're very similar. So if I just want like something with a little bit more grainy texture, with a little bit, more roughness to it, I'll use its sister brush. We'll say sister brush, and this is the brother brush. So I'll use those two in conjunction with each other. This brush, I don't use quite that often. But again, it's just another one of those like really great, just rough textural brushes, kind of charcoaly. Not a brush I use like a lot, but definitely a one that I use. Same with this one. It's very similar to this one. That's why I put them next to each other, and that they're both kind of like a typical rake brush set to direction. So the angle jitter, right? Remember, angle jitter is set to direction. But one is a little bit more textural, one's a little bit softer. So there are special cases where I would use it for just adding a bit of texture. This is a brush I've had in a lot of sets. I've had it for many years. Don't even remember where it came from. But it's a really, really great brush. It's just like a very simple, like bristly kind of brush. Use it for grass. Use it for if you want to like, paint in some edges or loss of edges. It's a very good brush for doing that. It's very fast. It's a very low res kind of brush. It's not going to slow your computer down at all. But there's something about it that's just, I don't know. It stayed in my set for many, many years. I think since college, I've never gotten rid of it. It's just such a great brush. This diamond looking brush is really good for line work, and I showed earlier, but look at that texture. That's really nice texture. Feels like I'm painting on, like drawing on a canvas or something. It's so much fun. This brush is very similar to this one in that I would use it probably for the same types of situations, like line work, or adding in if I want to give it like a calligraphy feel. I could sign my name with it. Very, very strong brush for line work and stuff like that. This brush is actually very similar to these guys over here. Maybe I should move them. Maybe I should move this guy over here because I feel like they're very, very similar. Yeah, that's probably better because this. I'll run through them because they're all like set to direction. They're all textural and they're all like a typical rake brush. So I feel like those should probably all sit together. See, as I'm going through this, I'm reorganizing them. This is a very basic round brush. If you got my round brush tutorial from the video before where I do the painting a King's Welcome, and I also do a round brush tutorial. These are very much from that. This is just a typical oval brush set to flow jitter, and this is a typical like squashed circle, like a ellipse brush set to opacity, the flow jitter. The transfer set to opacity jitter is on this brush right here. So they're very basic round brushes. This I'll use for line work. That's why it's sitting next to these other line work brushes. And this brush is actually a brush that I could do 80% of a painting with. It's a very basic, very simple round brush that has a lot of versatility. This is literally the same as the previous brush, except that it's flattened. It's again a really nice brush for conveying space on a landscape. You know, when you're painting in the ground, you need something a little flatter to show how space is receding. Really great brush for that. The next brush is this guy. This guy I use a lot for just like a lot of rim light, or just if I need to make a sharp, like traditional looking mark, sometimes I'll use it. It's a brush that I will often like go into the settings and adjust a little bit. Sometimes I don't want it to be so blotchy. Sometimes I want it to be a little bit more fine. But right now in my settings, it sits a little bit splotchy. It's a very particular brush for very particular situations. But it sits with the other, it probably should sit with the other line brushes, to be honest. You know what, let's move that over there. The next set of brushes are going to be like broad general texture brushes. Not quite a charcoal in my opinion, but just really good for like scumbling kind of feel, adding some rough texture here and there. So this is a brush I use quite a lot for that. Probably my main like just rough texture brush, or if I want to reduce edges here and there. This also is a very good brush for that. Again, in this one, I'll often adjust the settings to like setting a minimum diameter on size jitter. Sometimes I don't want it to be quite as pointy on the beginning and end of the mark, you know, like that. Sometimes I want it to be a little bit broader. It just depends on the situation. A good, just general texture brush. This is one that I had in my set for a very long time. It has a really nice kind of like natural bristle mark making. This guy should probably sit somewhere else, to be honest. So let's move him. Let's move him up here. I think that's a better spot for him, because it is definitely a kind of a workhorse brush where I could do almost a full painting with just it. And if you push down, it gets a nice solid mark, and then if you're light with it, you get a nice bristly, traditional looking mark. Here, we're gonna have to switch this. Or this is another line brush. So it's another line brush. I'm gonna have to move this over to with the other line brushes. But definitely a brush that I use for line making, like for line work, if I want to make a really traditional looking mark. Also, I sometimes will like increase the size and use it for like chunking in a silhouette or large shapes. You could even go to the shape dynamics and do pen pressure set to minimum, so that you can get like a really fine, you know, thin, fine mark for just blocking out silhouette. So I'm probably gonna have to move this guy with the other line brushes. We'll say like here. This is kind of a wispy brush. I have a couple other wispy brushes, I call them, but yeah, it's a very soft brush that has that traditional mark. It feels like a scumbly wet watercolor brush. Very good for just adding texture and just clouds or soft areas where you don't want your brush stroke to be a little too aggressive. Here's another one that's very similar to it. And that leads us from the wispy brushes to the soft brushes. So this is just a very standard soft brush. Pen pressure set to flow. Another very standard soft brush, only I added scatter to it. So you can get a really nice, you know, you could show how space recedes. You could show particles in focus and out of focus. It's a very magical brush and very, very simple to make. So I encourage you guys to go into I'm not going through all the brush settings for every brush, but I really encourage you guys just to take a look and see how each differ. This brush is pure magic. I use it a lot. It was in my old set. I've kept it for so many years. I don't remember where I got it originally. It's just magical. Just look at that. So fun to paint. Typical cloud brush. I've had this in my set for a long time. It's just clouds. Same thing here. Maybe I like this a little better. It's a bit more abstract. You could use it for different, you know, properties. This brush has some color dynamics attached to it, so you'll get a variety of different light and dark shapes as it overlays on top of each other. Again, another smoke cloud brush. I use them for different kinds of situations. It just depends. These are round texture brushes, so this is just a basic round brush with a little bit of texture added to it. I don't know why they're there. I don't know. I just go back to texture brushes. These are probably I probably put these in the list because these are the texture brushes I use less so. So I didn't put them up with the rest of them because generally the brushes I use the most are at the top of the list, and the ones I use the least are more towards the bottom. But you could use this for all kinds of things. Sometimes I'll use this for like a little bit of detritus or some twigs and leaves in a scene. Going back to some charcoal brushes that I use a little less often, but on occasion, since I've had these for such a long time, I remember to use them, and they're right here on the list. This is another general texture brush. I feel like I do use this quite often. I feel like this should be moved with the other ones over here. I'm going to move it over here. It is a brush I use quite often. I feel like it just sits better with the other general texture brushes. Yeah, I think that feels good. This brush, I love this brush quite a lot. It's really good for like painting in like wood grain. It looks like wood grain when you paint it down. Or you could use it for kind of like grass, or if you want to like adjust, like blur out edges and stuff with it. This brush has so much good utility that, I don't know, it's important. I use it a lot. It should probably be higher in the list. This is a brush that does something very similar. In terms of like you could use it for grass, you could use it for just creating like wood texture or any kind of scratchy texture, and it has that rake brush feel. But since I use it a little bit more for grass, that's kind of why it's not with the rest of the rake brushes. These brushes I created, I was inspired from, I think John Park had some brushes that he made that are similar to this, but it wasn't quite what I was feeling, so I went ahead and made my own. And I when I make these brushes, and these are typically for, these brushes are typically for just like painting in grass or like little fine details or those little hard edges in foliage where you just need it to pop out a little bit more. When I make these brushes, I kind of add a texture, softened edge in the top and bottom, just so the brush as a whole, as a stamp, is not so overly aggressive, right? You have some areas where the edges kind of fade off, and some areas where the edge is a little bit sharper. I made these brushes, but I was really inspired by the ones John Park did. Of course, I looked at a lot of Studio Ghibli background painting, and I was trying to find like the different shapes that they use, the kind of brush strokes and shapes that they use to convey like foliage, and I was sort of simulating that by creating these brushes. So I would use this very sparingly, very delicately, just in certain areas, just to make foliage pop. By looking at a lot of the Studio Ghibli paintings, I noticed that a lot of their foliage is very rough and kind of loose, but then they'd have certain areas where it would just be popped, like an edge or something, like a very opaque mark is very sharp and pops forward, and that's what this brush is for. I wouldn't use it for like painting a whole field of grass or something, just for those areas that need to pop. Same thing with this. This is kind of a leaf brush. Sometimes I'll actually go into brush tip shape and actually flatten it down a little bit more, depending on how I want the perspective, or if I want leaves to be blowing in the wind or like flipping over. So I'll often adjust the shape dynamics or the tip shape depending on how I want to use it. Same thing for this one. This one has a bit of scatter on it, so it's a bit more like particly. Again, use these very sparingly. I wouldn't do a full painting with them. Here's a very standard rake brush, but I was looking at a lot of Studio Ghibli background painting, and I noticed they use sort of like a paintbrush that is like the bristles kind of like fan out, right? And then it makes this kind of like nice rake mark, and they use it very delicately. And I saw that, and I wanted to make a brush very similar to that, and kind of learn how they use it by making a brush and using it myself. So that's what that is. Again, very sparingly. This is a brush maybe you could use a little bit more broadly. I used this in my Zelda fan art years, felt like years ago, but I guess it wasn't that long ago. So this is that brush that I used for that. I made that brush specifically for that painting, and this is it right here. And this is another one as well that I use for a little bit more spiky grass brush. This is for like, residue, detritus, dead grass, rough texture, but a good brush for painting grass. These I think I also got from John Park. I'm not doing a very good job of telling you where I got some of these brushes. Maybe if I can think of it, I'll post a list of all the artists' brushes I stole. Yeah, but I really like these brushes because it's really good for painting in trees off in the distance or foliage. I use it kind of more like for massing out shapes. If I want to, paint trees off into the distance, it's a very good brush for doing that. And again, if you use the eraser on the same brush, you're able to like chisel out different details and stuff. So really, really great brush for that. And this is another one. The one next to it is another one that's very good for also painting in trees. The actual leaf detail on the brush is a little bit thicker and is a little bit more distinct. So that's kind of the main difference for me between those two. This is another kind of leaf brush with a bit of texture added to it. Used very sparingly. This is another one used very sparingly, just here and there, just if you want to like make that sharp mark showing a leaf. Another one doing the same thing if you want to show a little bit of overgrowth on a abandoned building, just adding a little bit of that in there. Again, very, very sparingly. I would stick to like just a general workhorse brush for doing a lot of foliage, and then use these brushes just to add those focal points. This is a great brush for doing the same thing, although you could probably paint a little bit more broadly with this one, and it's a very good brush with like since it has the shape dynamics, size jitter set to pen pressure, you're able to make foreground weeds and shrubs, and then background weeds and shrubs just by adjusting your pen pressure on the tablet. A leaf brush that I made that's very, very simple. I could scumble in a huge mass of leaves here, or I could just paint in a few as focal point. That's just like a focal point. And again, this is another brush where I would adjust the tip shape depending on the perspective that we're looking at the leaves as they fall back. So a very stylized, very simplistic brush for just those moments. These next brushes are kind of like scumbly ground brushes, so creating some ground texture. So 600, 965, all about texture on the ground, scumbling, that sort of thing. I would use it sparingly again. Another really great ground brush. I've had this one for a long time. It feels like when you paint it down, it feels like tire tracks, really, really great brush. This is another brush I've had a long time. It was kind of like a leaf brush, but it sort of turned into another one of those ground brushes. You can never run out of brushes that just add a little bit of loose texture, that add some detritus. I keep saying detritus, but add some ground coverage. There's all kinds of, if you look in environments, there's all kinds of history of leaves and grass dying, being grown over, dying, growing over. These kinds of brushes just add a little bit more life to the painting. this is a scatter brush with a little bit of flat edge to it, so they could be painted as, you know, flowers off in the distance, some sort of flattened piece of detail that's receding back on your ground if you're painting ground. Just another good brush to show space receding back. This is like a very soft round brush that I use for just loose texture. I use it very sparingly. I use it here and there. I don't really paint images that have this gritty of a texture, but I just really like the way it feels painting it down, so I left it in the list. So this is another one like the previous one where it feels good to paint. I use it very sparingly. I use it very rarely at all, actually, but I like it, so I keep it on the list, and maybe I'll move it up on the list if I start using it more. And here's yet another one, and it's a bit more splattery because we're starting to get to the splattery brushes, but it's a real fine kind of mist. It feels like airbrush when you can splatter or spit with an airbrush. It's similar feeling. This is a standard rake brush, but I use it very sparingly, so it's not with the other rake brushes. I probably use it for like massing out silhouettes and stuff like that. Another broad charcoal texture brush. Another one of those that are just barely making it on the list, so that's why they're in the bottom. And I'll probably have to reorganize these guys at the bottom of the list, because I'll leave them in there and include them in the pack of brushes, but I might need to get rid of them at some point because I just don't use them that often. Let's get into the splattery speckly brushes. So this is a very like general speckle brush. You know, you could use it for little details like flowers or something, plants receding, little flecks of light. This is my rivet brush. I used it when I was doing a lot of sci-fi work, when I worked on Destiny and stuff like that. You always need a rivet brush, right? Like a brush where you're painting like technology. It has like little rivet details in there. So there you go, rivet brush, very specialized. And then the splattery brushes, you know, and this is pretty self-explanatory. And you could use them as like light hitting particles, you know, in a scene, like as light's coming down, it's hitting pollen and stuff that's in the air, detritus, as some would say. So very speckly, and there's all kinds of different speckle brushes. So this is one. So we'll start with this one, and then you can see that one. Not too much of a difference, honestly. This one is a little bit more sparse, a little bit more spread out. This one, I love this brush because it feels like, it just feels like snow, you know, like snow out of focus on a film or something. Really cool particle brush. And then this is it's a variant of that, but it's much more spread out, much larger, much more sparse. And lastly, these are actually not brushes that I use as brushes. They're actually smudge brushes. So let me make some marks so I can smudge them out. So if we have this as a solid shape and I want to smudge, I changed the smudge hotkey. So look up smudge in the tools if you don't know what it is. I changed the hotkey to R because historically in Photoshop it was R, and then they switched it, and that's not right. It should be R. Come on. So with this smudge, with this particular smudge, 125, what it does is it doesn't smudge as much as it kind of blurs edges. So you get this kind of like nice soft blurred edge. And that's just with the smudge brush. It's just because in its properties, I have scattering set to both axes and the spacing set at just such a way that it doesn't smudge, it actually blurs. So it's a brush that I'll often use if I obviously just want to blur some areas out manually. This brush kind of does the same thing. It's a tree shape. It's kind of random. Like it was an accident where I was using this as just a regular brush, just playing around with it, and then I accidentally used it as a smudge brush, and somehow it actually works. You could see the difference. This is a much softer kind of blurred edge, whereas the tree shape smudge kind of gives it this really nice textural edge that has a different feel. So it doesn't feel so digital as it's smudged and blurred. I don't know, feels more tactile and physical with some grit to it. This smudge brush is meant to be a very hard smudge. It's for making aggressive changes to a painting. And you can see there's one edge here that's really sharp and one edge here that's really soft. So you're able to not only like smudge and adjust the painting, but also create edges. This one is a very aggressive. This next smudge brush is a very aggressive smudge brush that will take whatever you have sampled and just drag it aggressively. It's just a solid block. So this one you can very dramatically smudge around your painting, create designs, happy accidents. It's really fun to mess with in environment painting. And it just looks cool and it feels natural, like you're just like pushing oil paint around with a palette knife. And this last brush is just my signature. That's it. That's how I sign paintings. But anyways, that's it, guys. Thank you so much for watching the video and enjoy the brushes, and see you next time.